Welcome to 100 Plus, a historical overview of the most important people, places, and ideas of the last 3,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, the Christian faith, and you. If these episodes have been helpful for you, I encourage you, hit that like button and subscribe so you can follow along with this incredible journey of our Christian faith and Christian history. In today's episode, Mike will be focused on Thomas Cranmer and the Book of Common Prayer.
The ultimate goal of 100 Plus is to help people discover life with God and then to grow closer to Christ. There are a number of assumptions behind this, and consequently there are a number of ancillary goals. One of them is to help you understand the world, to gain a more accurate understanding of the world in which we live. This starts, importantly, it does not end, but it starts with an understanding of what happened before you were born. As I mentioned before, there's a sense in which we all join a conversation that's been going on for about 3,000 years. And it helps to know what people were thinking and saying before we showed up and joined in. As a Christian, I think it's important for a few reasons to do this. First of all, I believe a greater understanding of history helps us see God's unfolding hand over time. I also think it helps us see the absolutely unrivaled impact that Jesus had on the world. These two things can serve to strengthen our faith. And there are other things, to be clear. I believe that a greater understanding of what happened before us helps us to see that one person can make a difference, helps us see that we will all face challenges, helps us see that there are patterns out there. Not that history repeats itself, I don't think it does, but to quote Twain, it does occasionally rhyme. And it also helps us see the way some people have lived well and others have lived poorly. Well, I share all that to say that in today's episode, which is on Thomas Cranmer and the Book of Common Prayer, we do something that's a little bit unique. I sort of play a little bit at the end the role of a pastor. This book and this whole sort of period of time, I think, provides us with a segue to double down or to double back and to think a bit about devotional literature and our own growth in our relationship with Christ. So, we are still in the 16th century. We've looked at Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, and the five solas. I have also provided you with a flyover of the 16th century, talked about the Protestant work ethic, and given you an overview of the Catholic Reformation. I also did a podcast on the English Reformation, which I singled out as being different, in part because the Brits did their own thing, and because, at least, and worth our attention because as the British Empire expanded, and it does expand, right? It becomes this massive global empire. There's a long period of time in which the sun never sets on the British Empire. Because as the British Empire expanded, it took with it the Church of England. And the Church of England, also called the Anglican Church, here in the U.S. called the Episcopal Church, the Church of England grew and it becomes very large. Now, as an aside, let me say, there are Anglican churches globally, there are Episcopal churches in the U.S., there are also now Anglican churches in the U.S. So they're all part of the same Church of England global church, but in the Episcopal, in the U.S., the Episcopal Church represents the more historic and at this point generally the more liberal or mainline, theologically liberal, although often politically liberal as well, but theologically liberal, and that means something distinct. But because the Episcopal Church was growing more liberal, those who wanted to be part of the Church of England, those who appreciated the Book of Common Prayer, those who appreciated the liturgy, those who appreciated some of what had happened before them, but who did not want to follow the Episcopal Church's trajectory, end up in churches that are sort of commissioned usually by bishops out of Africa. So these are Anglican bishops. So there are Episcopal bishops in the U.S., but now the Anglicans, so in many cases African bishops, are planting Church of England churches in the U.S., and they're not called Episcopal, they're called Anglican. So all of that is a little bit confusing. It's why you have to know what was going on in the conversation before you joined it. The point being, the Church of England becomes a very large church. By some definitions, it's the third largest church in the world. Now, this all depends upon what you mean by church, what you mean by denomination, what you mean by sect, those kinds of things. The Roman Catholic Church is understood to be the largest church, 1.3 billion people. The Orthodox Church is understood to be the second largest, 220 million people. And then the Church of England is considered to be the third largest church with 80 million people. So some would say, well, the Church of England is a denomination within Protestantism, and that's much bigger than the Orthodox Church, but it's all, again, rather confusing. In any event, in an earlier podcast, I talked about the English Reformation, and we focused on the Act of Supremacy, where King Henry VIII declared himself to be the leader of the Church of England. I noted that Mark Knoll, the rather prominent church historian, said that this is one of the most significant events that has happened in the last 2,000 years. So King Henry VIII argues various reasons. Parliament passes this law, the English Parliament passes this law that says that the King of England is the leader of the church in England, not the Pope. Now, there's two narratives on this. One is that, the one that I was more familiar with until really just recently, is that King Henry VIII has got a problem. He wants a divorce from Catherine of Aragon because she's not produced a male heir. And so he also has his eye on Anne of Boleyn, and so he needs a divorce. The Pope will not give him one, and so in a little bit of a tiff, he simply declares that he doesn't care. He's not going to recognize the Pope. He's in charge. So not too surprisingly, that's not the story that you hear if you talk with an Anglican. And it's not the story that you hear if you look at the history of the Anglican Church in the Book of Common Prayer. So this second narrative says that the Church of England spread very early. It actually perhaps was started by Joseph of Arimathea, who is the one who helps take Christ's body down off of the cross and then gives him his tomb. Jesus is buried briefly in this tomb of Joseph. That Joseph then leaves Jerusalem and he heads to England, where he starts the church, perhaps taking with him the chalice that Jesus had used, the Holy Grail that Jesus had used to serve communion on that last supper. And that's why you got this Arthurian legend that, all these knights are tromping around in England, Great Britain, looking for the Holy Grail. They're looking for it because Joseph of Arimathea took it with him when he was helping to plant the church. And then 5 centuries later, 6 centuries later, when Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustine, not of Hippo, not the Augustine that we talk about the most often, but Augustine of Canterbury, when he sends Augustine of Canterbury to England to plant the church, when Augustine gets there in the 6th century, late 6th century, he discovers that there is already a church. And there's some arguments for this in history. I mean, obviously, the whole King Arthur, Holy Grail stuff is, that's coloring a little bit outside the lines. But there is some argument that says, Tertullian mentions Christians from England. It looks like there were representatives at the Council of Nicaea that come out of England. So I'm not sure exactly where the truth lies in all of this, perhaps somewhere in the middle, but those who are part of the Anglican communion would say that when King Henry VIII reclaims, when he claims the church in England, when he takes over and becomes the head of the church in England, and takes the monasteries and positions himself as the de facto head. When that happens, it's not that this disgruntled prima donna monarch is simply seizing something that wasn't his. It's that the Church of England that had long been established and then had become Celtic over time, and then when the Roman Catholic Church shows up in the 6th century, they overtake it. King Henry is just simply taking it back, and he's doing so because now at this point it's the Catholics that have jumped the rails. So I'm not sure what the truth is. Again, perhaps it's somewhere in the middle. Here's what we do know. Henry's older brother, so King Henry's older brother, Arthur, was the one who was supposed to be the king. And so very early on, when he's just a wee child, he is pledged to be married to Catherine, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, monarchs in Spain. They're the ones who commissioned Columbus. Arthur and Catherine were eventually married, but 5 months later, Arthur dies. So in an effort to keep the alliance between England and Spain intact, Henry, who at this point is himself but a wee child, is pledged to be married to Catherine. They eventually do marry, and over the next 20 years, she gave birth to 5 children, but only one, Mary, survives infancy. So now, suddenly, Catherine, Henry's wife, queen, is 40. And 40 is not the new 30 at this point. 40 is more like, 55. It's unlikely she's going to have any more children. Henry does not have the male heir that at that point in history needs in order for someone to succeed him. And so he starts shopping around, looking for a way out of this marriage so that he can marry someone else and have an heir. His gaze falls on Anne of Boleyn, and so he appeals to the Pope for a divorce. Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is tasked with arranging the divorce for the king, but he fails. At some point, this young religious scholar and church attorney named Thomas Cranmer emerges, and he argues that Henry ought to get the divorce based on the Levitical statements, chapters 18 and 20, that says that you should not marry your brother's widow. So he argues that the marriage between Henry and Catherine was never valid. Now, we don't know much about Thomas Cranmer at this point. We don't know much about his life up to this point. He was born in Nottingham, England in 1489. He appears to have been of modest means. He attended Jesus College in Cambridge, and he studied Renaissance humanism, which means he studied the Bible quite a bit at that point. He's briefly married. We know this because he loses his church position when he marries, but his wife dies in childbirth, and he moves back into the church. He stays at Cambridge, gets a BA, an MA, and a doctorate in theology, and based on one of his textbooks, which we have, based on what he scribbles in the margin, there's every indication that he favors Erasmus over Luther, so he shows no Protestant leanings at this point. As an aside, I should say that some have said that if Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, remember John Wycliffe was the guy who wanted the Bible translated into English, so he's Catholic, he's going to die a Catholic, he's then going to be declared a heretic and dug up, and then he's going to be burned, and his ashes sort of put into the river. But if Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation, Thomas Cranmer will emerge as the Ringo Star of the Transformation. So he's not Luther, he's not Calvin, he's not Zwingli, so he's not John, Paul, or George. He's not quite as famous as the first 3 Beatles, but he at least gets a spot on the drums, so to speak. So, in terms of the court case that Cranmer brings, there's a few things worth noting. King Henry's reasons for wanting a divorce are political. They're not because of passion. They're because of succession, not passion. He was not a saint. I'm not suggesting that he was anything of the sort. But as a king, he had the opportunity, so to speak, to sleep with whoever he wanted to sleep with. He doesn't have to get married in order to sleep around. What he needs is an heir. So the Pope appears to be sympathetic to his plight, but the Pope at this point is under the thumb of Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V's favorite aunt is Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. So the Pope cannot grant the divorce to Henry that Henry wants without getting really sideways with Arthur, who he cannot be sideways with. You can see, by the way, why Netflix comes up with mini-series on these on the palace life. By the way, I don't know whether or not Netflix has a mini-series on these particular characters or not, but there's a lot of palace intrigue. Well, so at some point, Henry grows tired of his Archbishop, Wolsey, who's not arranging the divorce. Things are just on hold. At around the same time, Anne of Boleyn turns up pregnant. So now King Henry is very anxious to get the divorce from Catherine and to marry Anne so that this child born to Anne can be his heir. If it turns out to be a son, then he has the heir that he needs. And so he fires Wolsey, and to many people's surprise, he appoints Cranmer to be the new Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a very high position. So, by the way, don't think that this is going to turn out well for Anne. So Cranmer is going to get appointed by the king to be the archbishop. And he immediately is going to grant the divorce, recognize the divorce to Catherine. Very quickly, King Henry will marry Anne. I haven't been able to figure out whether or not Cranmer officiates at this wedding or not, but he at least recognizes it and he approves of it. And so now Henry is married to Anne. Yes, Catherine is going to live on for a while. Anne will fall out of favor relatively quickly and she'll be beheaded. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When Cranmer is appointed archbishop and grants this divorce, the Pope is furious. He doesn't have a lot of power at this moment, and he's worried that if he pushes too hard, the Church in England will break away. So he doesn't say much, but in fact, the Church of England does break away. And so at this point, Cranmer now becomes the one who is in charge of the new Church of England, and he is the one who is going to shape it. Now, this is significant, perhaps more significant than you realize, because at that time, the way things were working out in the 16th century was this particular doctrine, and I can't say it in Latin, cuius regio, ius religio. So whose realm, his religion. So whoever is king or queen soon, whoever is in charge, whoever's the monarch, their faith is the faith that everyone else needs to subscribe to. And so what we have here are state religions. We have a state church being established. And in this case, it's the church in England. And so everyone is now going to be expected to, sort of in England, is going to be expected to follow King Henry as the leader of the church, and Cranmer is the one who is going to have a say in what this church looks like, what its practices are going to be. So let me divide the next sequence of events into 3 phases. So, and these revolve around the 3 phases of Cranmer's life. The first phase, Henry is alive, and Henry's instincts, although he has told the Pope to, take a long hike off his short pier, he's in charge. Henry's instincts still remain very Catholic. So he likes the Catholic liturgy. He tends to embrace transubstantiation, prayer to saints, all these kinds of things. So these are not, at this point, the instincts of Cranmer. But Cranmer, while he is the Archbishop and sort of in charge, he is not ultimately in charge. That's Henry. So Cranmer will get some reforms in place, and he'll shape the church some, and he'll come out with some new liturgy and some new prayers and other things. By the way, he appears to be relatively adept. Some of the first prayers that he has published that everybody is supposed to pray are prayers for King Henry to have a long reign and for God to shine his favor down on him. So these are things, of course, that Henry VIII would be a little bit hesitant to renounce. So there's this period initially, a half dozen years, in which Cranmer is now the leader, not equivalent to the Pope, because the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop in the Church of England, is the first of the archbishops. He's the first among equals, but much more an equal than, say, the Bishop of Rome is not just the first bishop among all the bishops, but very much in charge. So he's got to balance King Henry's positions, and then he's got to balance the positions of everybody else. And he has traditionalists who want to stay very Catholic, Anglo-Catholic, and then he also has much more reform-minded people in the church. The second phase happens when Henry dies and his son, Edward, comes to the throne. So after Henry divorces Catherine, he marries Anne. After he's going to divorce and then have Anne beheaded, he's going to marry Jane Seymour. And she is going to give birth to a son. She will die 12 days later, and complications of childbirth, but she has given him a son, Edward. Edward is going to become the new king. Edward is not going to be very old. He's not even 10 at the time. He is going to live to be 15 or 16 before he dies. He's much more Protestant in his inclinations, as are the people that are sort of controlling him, because he has people sort of being his, sort of helping him steward the throne. And when Edward is the king, then Cranmer is going to be able to issue lots of reforms. So he is going to allow the clergy to marry. He is going to change the thinking behind the Eucharist. He's going to move from the transubstantiation of the Catholic Church to the consubstantiation of the Lutheran Church. Then he's going to move over to the more real present sacramental view, reformed view of a John Calvin. He's also going to change the worship service out of Latin and put it into English, and he's going to publish this book, the Book of Common Prayer. And this book is going to increasingly, as he continues to revise it, have a greater and greater Protestant feel. So I'm going to pivot here in a second to focus the rest of our time on the Book of Common Prayer, but let me just finish up a little bit more about Cranmer's life. He is going to be, under Edward, he's going to be working as a leader in the Protestant movement to try and pull together all the Protestant leaders and see whether or not they can unify around certain doctrines. But very unexpectedly, Edward dies, and when Edward dies, everything blows up. So briefly, Cranmer will be able, through some political intrigue, to put this woman, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. She will be the queen for 9 days before she is pushed off the throne by Mary, who was the one who was sort of in line for the throne, Mary, who was the daughter of King Henry, and Anne. Mary, also called Queen Mary, or Bloody Mary, is going to be the queen, and she's very Catholic, and she's very mad that her mother was divorced and pushed aside. And so one of her very first acts is going to be to go after Cranmer, who of course had helped King Henry VIII divorce Mary's mom. So Cranmer is arrested, and along with Ridley and Latimer, tried as a heretic. He is imprisoned in the Tower of London. He is held there for 2 years before he is put to death. Hugh Latimer, by the way, is is the guy that has got that great quote with Thomas Ridley. They're both about to be burned to death for their Protestant views, and Latimer is the one that says to Ridley, "Play the man, Master Ridley. We shall this day light such a candle, but that by God's grace in England, as I trust, shall never be put out." So that's a famous quote. Find that in Fox's Book of Martyrs. Cranmer will recant. This is real church history. Not all your heroes. If Cranmer's a hero, not all the quote unquote good guys are as good as you would like. He will recant his Protestant positions 6 times, but Mary will not spare his life, and so he will then recant his recanting and go to be burned to death. And he, as he's tied to the stake, he thrusts his right hand, the hand that had signed the recantations, he thrusts that into the fire first to penalize it. Mary does not last long as queen, only 5 years. And then her sister Elizabeth is going to take over. And Elizabeth, who will be Protestant, will rule for 45 years and be much more embracing of the Church of England, the Book of Common Prayer, all the things that Cranmer had set in place. So we now turn to the Book of Common Prayer. So what is the Book of Common Prayer? Well, there are several ways to answer this. The first thing that we can say is that it turns out to be one of the more important books of all time because it is going to be the book, along with the Bible, that is going to profoundly shape the Church of England. And since the Church of England is going to grow to be such a huge church, 80 million members at the moment, it's very significant. Secondly, we can say it's a multi-dimensional book. When you read, and there's a biography of the Book of Common Prayer. There's a whole series of biographies about books, and the idea is that books have a life of their own. And so Alan Jacobs, a professor out of Baylor, has written a biography of the Book of Common Prayer. And when you read about this, you see that for some people, the Book of Common Prayer is really sort of a missionary effort. It's a desire, pretty specifically, to shape people in the image of Christ. Other people see it as a political tract written by Cranmer to shape England. A third thing that we could say about the Book of Common Prayer is that it is a book that exerts an enormous influence over the English language. The King James Bible, probably preeminent in terms of shaping English language. Shakespeare, also very prominent in shaping English language. But the Book of Common Prayer gives us lots of, well, for instance, if you just look at the marriage liturgy in the book, you see that there's a lot of things that you might not have realized were from the Book of Common Prayer. But, dearly beloved, we are gathered here this day. Okay, that's from the Book of Common Prayer. With this ring I thee wed, to have and to hold from this day forward. These are lines right out of the Book of Common Prayer. A fourth thing we could say about it is that it's a devotional book that millions of people have found helpful over the centuries. And Cranmer was really committed to this. So Cranmer, Book of Common Prayer, so not a book of priestly prayer. So Cranmer really wants to get to the common people. He wants to take the service out of Latin and put it into English. He wants to shape the devotional practices of people. So as opposed to going after, say, the sermons, and he does some of that, he'll publish a book on sermons that priests are supposed to preach, but he really wants to go after the devotional lives of the people. And then the last thing we can say about the Book of Common Prayer is it's this wild compilation of things. When you pick it up for the first time, you will be a bit lost. I remember 25 years ago, in a transition moment, Sherry and I end up shopping around for a church, and we tried half dozen churches. In 1 week, we went to an Episcopal church. And if you don't know your way around the Book of Common Prayer and you're trying to figure it out, I mean, there was a hymnal, there was a Bible, and there was the Book of Common Prayer. And people are jumping back and forth between these three books, and we are absolutely clueless. I mean, in this, you've got a bunch of prayers, you've got all the book of Psalms, you've got all kinds of liturgies. So for weddings and for funerals and for baptisms and for ordinations, you've got services for Lent and Holy Week. You've got all kinds of things going on. There's a calendar in there that talks about the holy year. There's all kinds of charts and tables. There's lectionary. There's the daily offices and prayers and which passages of Scripture you're supposed to be reading and all of these things. So it's, you can't tell the players without a program, but you got to know how the program works, and so it can be a confusing book. Perhaps the best way to describe the Book of Common Prayer is to say that Cranmer tried to put into one book, in English, all the prayers of the medieval church that had been in Latin and scattered in various smaller books. And he translates them into English, and then he wants to supplement those prayers with a lot of extra things that will help people in their devotional life. So you can almost intuit what happens here. Cranmer ends up, a little bit unexpectedly, in charge of the Church of England. The Church of England is now the Catholic Church up until the Act of Supremacy, and now all kinds of people in these churches in England are trying to figure out what their practices are going to be. What is it, that the priests are to say and do? How do we understand communion? What is the preaching supposed to be like? All of these things are sort of up for grabs. And so Cranmer will start to compile, along with some other people. It's hard for us to tell how much of this he writes, how much of this other people write for him, how much of this he just takes from prayers that were already in circulation at the time. But he assembles some books. Early on, they're not called the Book of Common Prayer. They're homilies, they're prayers. There's a book, a litany of prayers. And then you start to move towards it being the Book of Common Prayer. And this book then is, quote unquote, forced on all the Christians in England. So in 1549, the Parliament passes what's called the Act of Uniformity. Very controversial. It was divided, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. They could not reach consensus. Riots break out. Initially, the traditionalists like what Cranmer has put out more than the Reformed Protestant people like. Remember, Henry is still around, and Henry is much more traditional, much more Catholic in his thinking. But this book is forced on people in England, and there's pushback, there's riots. So the nonconformists, so if you're not part of the Church of England, think Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, Presbyterians, they all object to this book. They don't want to have to follow this book. What's being established, and this is why Mark Knoll will say this is such a big moment. What's being established is a state church. Now, the idea at the time is not that the Church of England is going to be, the Church of England is going to be the church in Nigeria. I mean, it's going to become that in Uganda and in India. I mean, the Church of England, as England becomes this empire and exports itself, the Church of England is going to go everywhere. But initially what's being established is a state church, as opposed to, for instance, a free church. So I graduated from Trinity Evangelical Free, Trinity Evangelical Free TEDS, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School is what I graduated from. I knew I was get that. But the idea is it's part of the evangelical free denomination, free as opposed to being a state-mandated church. So lots of people didn't like this. Perhaps one of the more famous people who did not like the imposition of the Book of Common Prayer was John Bunyan, who goes to jail for 12 years because he will not adhere to the Book of Common Prayer. It's while he is in prison for 12 years that Bunyan writes Pilgrim's Progress. So almost immediately after the first draft of the Book of Common Prayer comes out, revisions start, and they Cranmer takes out some of the more Catholic sounding terms like Mass and altar, and he moves in more Protestant directions with things. There will be ongoing rebellions, but Cranmer will hold his ground. As a matter of fact, July 21st, in that year, I think this is like the early 1550s, he will commandeer St. Paul's Cathedral, and he will vigorously defend the Book of Common Prayer and the church line. So, eventually all these things get packaged into what we know of as the Book of Common Prayer, and the edition that comes out in 1662 is sort of the one that many people will refer back to. The Book of Common Prayer will continue to be revised over the years. As a matter of fact, I think there was one that came out in 2019. And a lot of different countries will have their own, and so they're not all of equal quality. But let me just say two things as I wrap up here. First of all, let me note that the Book of Common Prayer can be a rich devotional guide. Now, I know that, and I'm speaking now as a pastor, I'm not playing a church historian on this podcast. Now I sort of shift into my pastoral mode and say that I know there's a lot of people, and I understand this because this was certainly true of me, that have been less than impressed with written prayers and formal liturgies. And the idea is that there's sort of a dead formalism to all of this. So let me say, liturgical churches, and I was on staff at one for 8 years, liturgical churches can be the worst, but they don't have to be. It's not necessarily about the liturgy. First of all, every church has a liturgy, even if it's not written down. Churches that say they don't have a liturgy follow a similar pattern, and people end up praying, although the prayers are spontaneous, the prayers are often very much alike. So there are patterns that people follow. I think there's some real wisdom in what Jaroslav Belikin, a relatively famous historian, said not too long ago. Tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. We do not want traditionalism. I suppose I should add, he says, it is traditionalism that gives tradition a bad name. So tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. So there can be great value in tradition. Now, as a Protestant, as an evangelical, I am not going to place tradition on par with the Bible. But there can be real richness as we look at the prayers that were thoughtfully and, dare I say it, prayerfully compiled, that are going to be shaped by Scripture and are going to help us perhaps expand the kinds of things that we would pray for. And the liturgy, formal ancient liturgies can be very rich. So the Book of Common Prayer can be a great resource, just like all kinds of other devotional guides. Some devotional books are really good, and some are not only not good, they can be not just shallow and tepid, they can be heretical. So the Book of Common Prayer, I think, can have great value. So the key thing, if I'm going to speak as a pastor, is not that you use the Book of Common Prayer, though you could. The key thing is that you do need to have your life shaped by devotional practices that are rooted in Scripture. Your life is shaped by your, quote, devotional practices. Your life is shaped by your habits. Your life is shaped by the things that you think about. And a book like the Book of Common Prayer can be one of the tools, and because of the way Cranmer did it, heavily shaped by Scripture, it can be one of the tools that can help shape you. I need to work hard, extra hard, I think, every day to have an inner world that is stronger than our outer world. And the outer world is getting pretty strong these days. So we need to have a life that is shaped not by the news, not by the media, not by social media, but that is shaped by the Word of God. So that's it. In our next episode, we turn the corner and we look at the Puritans, and we're on our way to the Enlightenment. So the Puritans are a little bit of a transition out of the Reformation towards the Enlightenment. See you then.